It's a great pleasure to be here. I've had the chance to travel around for a couple of weeks with my family who've now gone back to Australia, and I can tell you have a stunning country. And we really enjoyed our stay. I'm now starting to see a bit more of the farming and the canola cropping. I'm not an expert in South African canola, that's you guys, but I can hopefully share some things about our systems in Australia, and some of the things hopefully will be of use to you. Firstly, there's some people I need to thank, the people who made my trip possible and who made these meetings possible and who've been my hosts and company for the last few days, and I thank all of those people who I'm sure many of you are familiar with for the opportunity to come and talk to you and for looking after me so well. My talk is going to be broadly following this overview. I want to tell you a little bit about canola in Australia first so that you can understand the background to the cropping system there. Talk a little bit about yield targets because it's good to talk about 5-ton yields, but it's important to be realistic about and to know what your yield potential really is, and then to aim your management for the yield potential that's realistic for your situation. Then I'll get more into the issue that Andre wanted me to target, which is around crop establishment, and finish off with some issues of stubble, particular problems of establishing canola in stubble, which is also a live research issue in Australia. That's my email address, so if it's difficult for you to see something or you'd like to ask me anything or get me to send you more information, please send an email and I'll send that to you. So just briefly about Australian agriculture. The area where we crop, our dryland cropping system, is that yellow area, and wheat is the main crop, but these days we now grow canola almost everywhere we grow wheat. Initially canola was restricted to the better rainfall, more reliable areas, but with breeding and new varieties, canola is now pretty much anywhere we can grow wheat, we can grow canola, except in the northern area. You can see that the rainfall distribution across this southern and southeastern area is sort of equiseasonal here. This is where I'm based, this area here. But through South Australia and Western Australia, we get into more winter-dominant rainfall, which is more typical of this area. And we tend not to grow canola much up in this summer-dominant rainfall area. But it's essentially a very similar system, one crop per year, cereals, canola, some grain legumes, rotated with pastures. Our soils and climate, again, in common with South Africa, is low and variable. That's the typical annual rainfalls records for a farm. You can see the average is about 200 millimetres, but you almost never get the average. And you'll notice that the last 10 to 15 years we've already had a noticeable reduction in our rainfall. That's particularly been our autumn rainfall that we tended to rely on to get crops established, and that's created some changes and some shifts in our farming systems and in our management. But as I said, canola, we grow in all sorts of environments, and we have all sorts of results. Sometimes we get complete crop failures, as you can see there, gets up ankle high and that's the end of it in a dry season. Sometimes we cut it for hay because we get a good biomass, but the spring disappears. But you know, in better seasons we can have 3.5 ton crops are not uncommon now, and in some of our very high rainfall areas where people are growing canola on raised beds, 4 and 5 ton crops, commercial crops, are also possible. Farming BC, or before canola, as I say, up to the 1980s, we really had a clover pasture, grassy clover pastures, rotated with cereals. So the sheep for wool and cereals, and that was our system for well over 40 or 50 years. We burnt to deal with residues and cultivated for weed control, and this was the system that persisted in Australia until the 1990s, when we had herbicides, the introduction of no-till farming, pasture systems, the cropping intensified and became more diverse, particularly on the back of crops like canola and lupin. The pasture phase became shorter and the cropping phase extended. Farms got bigger, and this now tends to be a typical system. Although I'd say we really don't have a lot of high value grain legumes in the system, and that second crop would tend to be another canola crop more often than not. So it's quite an intensive cropping system at the expense of pasture. And typically most farmers would be on some kind of no-till system, but that's also becoming a little more flexible. Now, Australian farmers are essentially wheat farmers, 20 million hectares of wheat and 2 million hectares of canola roughly. So, and canola's initial expansion was very much to do with the benefits of the crop to the cereals. So the rotational and system benefits of canola is one of its big economic impacts on the farm. And although today we're talking about profitability of canola, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that that crop in your system has benefits that flow through the right system, whether it's weed control, disease control, and it's important to value that in your system and add that to your economic thinking around canola. So our farmers voted with their feet. When they saw wheat crops after canola, remember the pastures had grasses, wheat and barley are grasses, the system was full of root diseases and other grass pests, and so a canola break made a real impact. Now that's the picture which tells 1,000 words. This is the data not just from Australia but from around the world, plotting the yield of wheat after wheat against the wheat of yield after canola. Now if they were the same, everything would be sitting on that straight dotted line. But you can see that almost always wheat after canola yields more than wheat after wheat. And in fact, putting all the data together for Australia, it's around 0.8 of a tonne per hectare on average. And it's extremely variable from year to year, but essentially the average benefit was consistent. Whether you're growing a 6-tonne wheat crop the next year or a 2-tonne wheat crop the next year, the average benefit was around 0.8 of a tonne. So that's important to know that and not forget that canola has this system benefit. And these days it's as much about the benefits for herbicide-resistant weed control as for disease or other issues. So this is just a graph to show you that we only really started growing canola significantly in Australia around 1990, and it really took off. That green line is the area, and the blue line is the average yield. You can see it really took off in the 90s when we had triazine-tolerant canola varieties, which allowed us to control wild radish and other weeds. It really went a little bit too far at that time and got pushed into areas that were too dry and too marginal before we had the right management and variety systems in place. And we then went into what we now call the millennium drought, about 10 to 12 years of extremely low rainfall and below average rainfall, late rains and very dry springs. And it's taken us some time to get the right varieties and systems in place to deal with those sorts of seasons, which are now much more common. But you can see we've recovered now, and we're up above 2.5 million hectares, and our average yields are not that dissimilar to what you're achieving here, in fact, overall. They bounce around a lot because the area as the area changes, of course, and canola shifts back to the more reliable areas, then tends to stabilise the yield. But we've got some hybrid varieties that you'll hear about later, which are now being more adopted more widely as well. So that's a little bit of a background about the canola system in Australia. So I wanted to move on and talk about yield targets. So it's important to be able to manage canola well and profitably to know what yield is realistic. And our growers have some very simple rules of thumb. They expect canola to yield about half of what their wheat's yielding. That's a simple rule of thumb. I'll show you how reliable that one is. The one that was very powerful in Australia was what we call water limited yield. So to know how much yield your canola should have delivered per millimetre of available water to the crop or available rainfall. And I'll show you a bit about that, because that's a useful rule of thumb to guide you as to whether your canola really did as well as it should have, and to help you with your planning for nitrogen and other things. Nowadays we have some more sophisticated crop simulation models which have been made available to farmers via the internet, and there you can put in more information about your management, your variety, your sowing date, your nitrogen, and farmers are using that, and consultants mostly, to deal with nitrogen management decisions. But that requires a fair bit more information about your soils and other things. So in terms of whether canola yields about half of wheat, this is, if that were true, then all those points would be sitting on that red line. And so you can see it's not a bad rule of thumb when wheat yields are around above 4 tonnes per hectare. It's not a bad rule of thumb if you've got to use one. Actually, quite often your canola can be yielding higher than that. It can be yielding 60% of wheat. As the seasons get drier and the wheat yields tend to be lower, the yield that you achieve is more related to when a particular stress occurs, not really. So if the stress happens to hit when the canola's, at its sensitive stage and the wheat's not, one will do better than the other. And so that rule of thumb becomes a little less reliable when conditions get more stressful, because it's more about the timing. But it isn't a bad rough rule of thumb to think about how it's performing. And quite often in Australia, when the seasons, the wheat might move from an average season 4 tonnes to a good season 6 tonnes, and the canola was still sitting at 2 tonnes and didn't really move, we realised that maybe we've got some problems in the canola system because the wheat was responding to the better seasons and not the canola, and that alerted us to go and look at what was happening in wetter seasons to our canola. The water limited yield concept, so this relates grain yield to the available water to a crop. Now in our system, our soils store quite a bit of water, so we simply add the rainfall that we get from sowing till windrowing or swathing to the water we think was stored in the soil. We subtract about 100 millimetres. You can see the line is crossing at about 100. Now that's the evaporative loss that you're always going to lose as the crop's establishing. So if you take your average rainfall in the season as 300 millimetres, for example, and you subtract 100 millimetres, that's 200 millimetres. And in this case, multiply by about 10 or 11, it suggests that you should, on average, get about a 2 tonne yield. But you can see that the water use efficiency can vary, and that sort of just depends on when the rain falls. If it all falls in winter and you get no spring rain, it'll tend to be on the lower side, around 8. In very good seasons, when the rain's falling throughout the season and there are no major stress periods, then you can achieve up to 15. And so 15 kilograms per hectare per millimetre for a season where you had 300 mils of rain should take away 100, it's 200, multiplied by 15, you should be getting about a 3 tonne yield. So it's a rough rule of thumb. Up here above that line, it's just physiologically impossible to do better than that. We know how plants trade water for carbon, and if you're up there, you perhaps done something wrong with your calculation. But it's when you're below that line that you can really look at your agronomy, look at your management and ask, well, what's going on? And this is a powerful tool. Our farmers would pool their data after a season and look at it anonymously, so the dots were on the graph, but no one knew who was who. They all had the same rainfall, pretty similar soils, and all the variability when they're sitting under this curve is related to different management, and that helped them to think about what might work and what might not. So in Australia, as I said, we've had this period of drying climate. Our rainfall we used to rely on in May and April to establish our crops has been dropping away. We've had to get much better at storing rainfall in the summer and then being prepared to establish crops early, as soon as we get any rain, or even on the stored moisture, or even sowing it dry, to get the crop in early enough, because sowing time, early sowing tends to maximise your yield potential. And this has been driven by not only the change in season, but we now have better management practices. Our fallow management in the summer is better. We've got better seeding equipment. We've got pesticides, herbicides, and other agricultural chemicals that can assist us with some of the issues with early sowing. And we've also got new varieties, new hybrid varieties, and these are much more vigorous, they grow much more quickly, and so we've been looking at how to manage those varieties with this early sowing. There has been some concern that, a big vigorous hybrid variety sown early is going to create a whole lot of biomass and use all the water and run out of water. We haven't really found that to be so, and I'll show you some data, but this is an active area of research in Australia currently, how to optimise these earlier sowing systems. So a lot of people talk about sowing date, and the other thing I want to emphasise, I guess, is For every region, for every farm, there'll actually be an optimum flowering period. So it's when the crop's flowering that it's very sensitive to stresses. And I understand you guys don't have the same issue with frost we have, but we tend to have flowering squeezed between the last frost and when things start to get too hot. So we've got this period where we're trying to get the canola to flower. It also relates to the availability of water. And what we find is if you understand the flowering period, what you need to then do is target the sowing date and variety combination that'll hit that flowering period. So if you just change the sowing date with the same variety, and you don't understand that variety's response to day length and temperature, then you can have things flowering right out of their window. And so as we've moved our sowing time earlier, we've had to think about the varieties we're using and make sure that those varieties are adapted to still hit that flowering period. Okay, so once you've done that, it's a matter of managing the biomass then to make sure that at flowering there's enough biomass, adequate biomass, but not too much biomass to support your yield. So for example, a 3-ton canola crop needs about 5 tons of biomass at the start of flowering to support that yield. If you've got a lot more biomass than that, you're probably not going to need that, so you've just grown some excess biomass. If you don't have that much biomass, you won't be able to support that higher yield. So that's why I say to understand and know what yield you're targeting and to set that crop up so that it's got sufficient biomass at flowering to hit that yield is important. And then the question is, what's the most profitable, what's the most economic way to have that biomass? Is it more nitrogen? Is it seeding rate? Is it to move to a hybrid variety? There's a lot of ways to manipulate the biomass a crop produces, and we're trying to understand the most cost-effective way to achieve that biomass. And as you'll hear later, there's no doubt that certain varieties do have a capacity to convert a particular amount of biomass into yield more effectively. They're just allocating more biomass to grain more efficiently, whether it's with height or pod, the amount of energy they're putting into pod walls. There's a lot of things that can be manipulated with varieties, and there's a few varieties that are performing well in Australia at the moment. And just to show you, I'm going back to that graph I just showed. I've added the red line and the red dots. They're some of the yields and water use efficiencies we've been achieving in the last 2 or 3 years with these early sowing systems with hybrids. And you can see that they're up on that 15 kilogram per hectare line, but the big change is that we've actually, if I can get this mouse working, it's white so you can't see it, that's okay. What we've really done is we've pushed back this evaporation. Remember before I said you've got to subtract 100 millimetres because you're going to lose that to evaporation? If you get a hybrid established early and it covers the ground quickly, you reduce that evaporative loss. And we can reduce it back to about 60 millimetres, and we can have that water being used to grow biomass. And there's other reasons why early sowing in our system helps. The roots get deeper. The crop is growing more in a cooler part of the year, and water use is much more efficient. So these are having some promise, and I don't know enough about the system here to know whether you've also got this opportunity, but I think certainly understanding where your optimum flowering period is and then getting the right variety and sowing date combination to hit that and set the biomass up are the key points, I think, to hitting your yield potential. So moving now on to establishment issues, the next question is, all right, if that's my yield potential, how many plants do I really need per square metre? And again here I think people tend to say, oh, I sow 3 kilos, I sow 4 kilos. You really need to know your grain size, your germination percentage, and your establishment, how many of those germinable seeds that you can get successfully established to try and hit the right plant population. I'd say in Australia, since we started growing canola, our target plant densities have moved from, we used to target 70, 80 plants per square metre. We're now down to sort of 30 or 40 plants per square metre being the optimum. It comes down to cost of seed and the relationship between plant population and yield potential. But we find this is sort of the sweet spot for us, and we tend to advise people not to go too low, mostly now because of herbicide weed problems. A good vigorous canopy sufficient plant populations required to really outcompete ryegrass and other weed issues. So anyone who's got weed issues like that should be opting to be slightly on the higher side. And generally, when you do economic analysis, at least in our situation, this is more sensitive, economically it's more sensitive to how many seeds you get established and the seed cost rather than the yield or the seed size. But anyway, it's just one way to sort of shave your costs if you can, to know what plant population you're aiming for. And there's a little bit of data just for a range of different types of varieties. This is the typical sort of data that comes out of that kind of plant population work, and you can see that the response curve flattens out very much above 40 and between 30 and 40 for a range of varieties at yields from 0.5 tonne to 2.5 tonnes seems to hold out pretty well. The interesting thing about this is that if you push up the rates of seeding to try and increase the plant population, the establishment rates tend to decline. So you can see this is for hybrids and this is for open pollinators. So when people have higher target plant densities, for unknown reasons, when you're trying to put more canola down the tube, the proportion of the germinating seed that actually establishes declines. I'm not really sure what's driving that, but it's interesting. Even the Canadians, in a lot of their research, and this is research work too. This is not growers. This is people in research plots. So that's an interesting issue. But just to be aware of that if you are trying to push those things up, and we're typically often achieving only 60% of germinable seed establishes successfully. And I think the main issue is seeding depth uniformity for us. If you are sowing earlier, people have sort of asked, if we sow earlier and we're using a hybrid, can we drop the rate back because we're going to get vigorous growth, it's still warm. And you can see here when we've pushed back into sort of the beginning of April with a hybrid, we were able to drop the plant population back. This is at a yield level of 1.8 tonnes. But you can see even into mid-April or late April, keeping that plant population up around 40, 45 here gave us a benefit. And once you're sowing very late, to drop your plant population back too low really starts to impact on yield. So, once you know what plant population you're targeting, then there's just a whole range of a checklist to go through. And first is to obviously use seed of good quality, and I'll show you a bit about that. Again, do you know your germination rate, your seed size, and what establishment rate you can achieve? Those things together will give you your seeding rate. So rather than just stick with 3 kilos per hectare, that might be the case for a particular line of seed, but if that changes, and from year to year seed size will change, this is a way to maybe refine things a little. Obviously then, as I said before, I think our difficulty mostly with low establishment is the difficulty in getting canola seed at a uniform and suitable depth. That's the challenge, I think. Stubble makes that challenge sometimes more difficult, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The other one I've got there is separation from fertilizer. We have usually put starter fertilizer down the seed with the seed traditionally, and we tended to think that, you know, as long as you had less than 20 kilos of N and it was mostly N, you wouldn't have a problem with fertilizer affecting establishment. But the more we look at that, the more we're suggesting now that try to separate, if you can, separate the seed and fertilizer completely, because even relatively low levels under certain conditions can impact on establishment. The drier the soil and more alkaline soils, certainly there's more difficulty, but it's just something to be aware of, that all of nitrogen, phosphorus and even sulfur fertilizers can all have an impact on seedling establishment under certain circumstances. And of course you would no doubt have your own range of emergence and establishment pests, and certainly if we're pushing a little bit with our earlier sowing, we need to be mindful of those. So just to show you a bit about quality seed, when I'm talking about quality seed, not only the germination percentage, but for establishment, the seed size seems to be the most important thing. So whether it's a hybrid or an OP, it appeared to be size that was the main thing. And hybrid seed just happens to be bigger than OP seed generally, and it seemed to be the seed size rather than the hybridity that was driving things. And so several studies have suggested if you can screen your seed, or your seed is greater than 2 millimetres in diameter on average, that seems to be the critical point at which most successful establishment occurs. In terms of seed depth and uniformity, in an ideal world, if there's plenty of moisture, canola likes to be sown quite shallow, but generally your soils and probably our soils are often, our soils at least, are often drying at the time we're trying to sow, and so in practice we're putting it deeper just to ensure there's adequate moisture to get it up. But this poor depth control, you can see there that when canola has to emerge from quite deep in the soil, although it can, the cotyledons are small and they're sort of behind the 8 ball from the word go. You've got uneven establishment. They will establish, but they're behind. And I'll just sort of show you some data here. You probably can't read the numbers, but those 3 bars, the left-hand side and the right-hand side are just showing 2 different areas in Australia. And the top graph is the emergence from 25 millimetres, 50 millimetres and 75 millimetres. Okay, so you can see how establishment at both sites declines as the seed has to come from deeper. And the hybrid is the black bar and the OP is the white bar. So the hybrids do have a slight advantage over the OP, but really the seeding depth is the driving factor there. The graphs below are showing the yield, and what that just shows you is that there can sometimes be a dramatic effect on establishment, but it doesn't always in the end affect yield. Just depends on what the yield potential of that particular year was. But certainly seed trying to come up from below 5 centimetres really struggles and is going to be so far behind that it's going to have an impact on yield. And this is just to show the effect of seed size. So here on the left-hand side, that's a graph of emergence percentage. And the 2 lines at the bottom are small seeds, so seed around 1.2 millimetres in diameter compared to the large seed, which is 2.2. And so you can see there that seed size, and sorry, it's 25 millimetre sowing depth, 50 millimetre and 75 millimetre again. So you can see that seed size is the biggest issue, whether it's hybrid or not. If you've got seed that's graded to 2.2 millimetres, it will emerge from 5 centimetre depth pretty successfully, and the hybrid really didn't add much value. Once you've got seed that's at 75 millimetres, very deep, it's struggling to emerge if it's small seed, but if it's larger seed, it was still able to emerge. But there, the hybrid had a real advantage over the OP. So hybrid seed, large seed, is going to help if you're in a situation where you've got uneven seed bed or you have to sow deep to chase moisture. Here's a picture just showing what I was talking about in terms of fertilizer burn on the seed. And as I said, it can be quite dramatic in some cases. As I said, we've generally been thinking there were safe levels of fertilizer, and we get away with it in certain conditions, but it's just an issue if you've got a capacity to separate seed and fertilizer at sowing. It's probably going to be useful. So in terms of stubble, basically when all of those principles we were just talking about, stubble just adds some difficulty into being able to achieve those things, and there's a few different ways to deal with stubble. So one is to avoid it, to reduce the stubble load in some way, whether that's through, in our case, it can be through burning or grazing. The other way to avoid it is to have canola in your sequence planned after a grain legume or some part of your crop sequence where there's not a lot of crop residue. In Australia at the moment, the problem of herbicide-resistant weeds has meant that a lot of people now need a double break. So they need 2 broadleaf crops in a row to deal with herbicide-resistant ryegrass weeds and other weeds. And so they'll target the canola for after a grain legume where there's less residue. The grain legume is also going to leave nitrogen and moisture in the soil, and the canola really benefits from that in the sequence. And so that sequence, as I said, as a whole, that system as a whole, is something that people have moved to. If you are in a more cereal-dominated system, intensive system, then and you're in a no-till system, well, then we've got to deal with the stubble in some way, and all those principles I mentioned hold. Now, there's been a lot of work comparing discs and tines, and which one's better, and our experience is that you can get both systems to work, but you really need to start managing the stubble from the time you harvest the previous crop, if it's a cereal stubble, because tine systems and disc systems, require the stubble to be in a different condition for success. So, as I said, most farmers in Australia are trying to avoid burning stubble if they can, but in certain circumstances, if they have a heavy stubble and they want to get in and get a good canola crop in early, they may need to burn. They'll do that very late. They may burn it the day before they seed. So they're not allowed to burn in the summer because of fire restrictions, but in the autumn they'll choose to just put a burn in. It's called a late cool burn. It doesn't leave, it leaves some residue on the soil and it minimises the time you've got the soil exposed, but they'll often be seeding directly into that ash. More common now is people will be doing narrow windrow burning, so they'll be concentrating all of the trash, the chaff that's coming out of the header into a narrow windrow behind the header instead of spreading it. And the idea there is to then go in and burn those narrow windrows while it's still hot and get a very hot burn. And they can kill up to 90%, 95% of the herbicide-resistant weed seed in that. So that's a matter of trying to concentrate seed that might otherwise be spread to create a problem. And there you've still got cover on the soil. The majority of the soil is covered and protected, but you just have these narrow strips. There are other machines that the Harrington seed destructor and other things. This whole area of harvest weed seed management is a big part of our herbicide-resistant weed management strategies now. And so mechanical destruction of the seed with a machine that crushes the seed is another process, but it's a little more expensive. As I said, the other option is for people to just try and put canola into lower levels of residue. In this case, this is canola going into a faba bean stubble in one of our fields this year. And there's just a lot less residue, and we can maintain the stubble, and it's just a matter of organising the crop sequence in that way. But the issue of stubble is something we started looking at back in the late 1990s when farmers were coming to us and saying, look, my canola in my wheat stubble is just not growing. It just sits there in the winter and doesn't grow. I put nitrogen on, it just doesn't seem to be growing. They thought at that time that there might be some chemicals, some allelopathic effects coming out of the wheat straw. So we had a PhD student look at this closely. So that kind of effect there, that's not an effect of plant population. We could always get the plants up, but they just sat there in the winter and didn't grow very fast. And so we did a lot of experiments to look into what was causing this. One of the experiments we became a bit famous for was this experiment. So we were trying to separate the physical from the chemical effects of residue. And so those yellow plots there are yellow plastic drinking straws that I had the company make, and I put them on the soil surface to compare it to what wheat straw was doing, because the plastic straws obviously don't have any allelopathic effect. It's just the physical effect compared to the chemical effect that you may get with wheat residue. And then we had burn and remove. And just to show you, basically, to cut a long story short, the plastic drinking straws just behaved exactly like the wheat residue. So that told us that the residue is doing something physical. And what it turned out to be is that if you've got canola that has to grow up through wheat straw, the wheat straw is shading the stubble, is shading the canola, and the light quality under the straw changes the ratio of red to far red light, and that causes plants to etiolate. So they grow very long and spindly because they're trying to get up through the stubble. And when they do that and open their cotyledons above the stubble, the cotyledons are much smaller because they've used a lot of energy to grow that hypercotyl. And also, so you've got small cotyledons that open, and that just puts them behind because you're trying to grow, and every day it's just compounding interest. They're way behind the one that was already open. And every morning in winter above a stubble layer, the temperature is much colder above stubble than above soil because the warmth is in the soil and the stubble is protecting the seedling. And the growing point of canola is above the stubble. The growing point of wheat stays below the ground until it starts to elongate. But the canola growing point is above the stubble. So every morning in winter, it's getting 2 or 3 degrees colder minimum temperature. So just a combination of light and temperature differences slows down growth, and it just takes a long time to catch up. And in years where you've got a high yield potential, sometimes it doesn't catch up. And one of the farmers, so I can just show you that we did an experiment just to show we could create exactly the same effect without wheat stubble, just by making the canola grow up through a bit of tubing where it was shaded, and by the time it opened its leaves at the top of that tubing, you know, we had plants that look exactly like plants that are having to grow through wheat stubble. So one of the growers was at one of our field days and said, "Oh, I've been growing canola in wheat straw fine, you know, come out to my farm and have a look." And sure enough, he had sort of shifted his system onto slightly wider rows. He had narrow tines and a system that tended to push the residue up onto the ridges between the rows. So the canola was emerging without any stubble over the top of it. The stubble was just pushed a little bit to the side. And although there's still a little bit of stubble on the crop, and you can see there at an early stage that it looks a little smaller than the burnt treatment, it ended up yielding exactly the same. So it caught up. Whereas the one with stubble spread over the top, as you can see, the seedlings were just smaller in winter and just took a very long time to catch up in their growth. So the principle here is just try to keep stubble off the top of the canola row. It doesn't have to be very far away, just need to try and keep it away from above the canola. So as I said before, managing the stubble starts at harvest, and so here in Australia now the growers are very conscious of the cost of harvesting, and they want to try and harvest high so they can, we've looked at the cost of harvesting and putting less material through the header. They really do make some savings, and that leaves relatively tall straw. They want the residue then spread as evenly as possible to avoid any clumps that are going to block the seeder, and also they'll really encourage pests, the sort of establishment pests that will live in that block stubble. So depending on your seeding system, you've got to think about how you want to manage your harvest process so the stubble's in the sort of state that you need it to be, so that your machinery, whatever it is, can get through. So if you're dealing with a tine system, basically the risk in a tine system is flat straw that's lying on the ground. It's either wet, it's been detached, so the cereal plants have been detached from the soil. That will then cause the residue to block around tines and cause problems. So one approach people are using is to move to slightly wider row spacings, to cut high at harvest, and then they'll be using some kind of inter-row sowing guidance to sow inter-row where there's less residue. Or they may come in and cut that high stubble with some kind of separate mulching process. And that just cuts the stubble to shorter lengths, and that will allow better passage. The other approach is if you've got narrower rows, or if you're going to graze the stubble and therefore it's going to be knocked down, again is to cut it low at harvest and just get it chopped up and spread early. And they may then reduce it a little bit with grazing. If there is a lot of residue on the soil, they may use a leading coulter just to cut through that and have the tine following, again to avoid wrapping around tines and blockage. Probably one of the main advantages for this system, if people are using Treflan or trifluralin as part of their weed control strategy in canola, then the soil disturbance around a tine opener is going to be of an advantage. If you're dealing with a disc system, the main risk with a disc system is basically not having the disc set up sharp enough or hard enough to cut through stubble and to penetrate the soil. So the risks here is hair pinning of the stubble under the disc, and then poor soil penetration. So when the discs are set up well, they will handle more stubble. There's no doubt about that. You will be able to sow into quite thick stubble, but it just has to be set well, and you have to achieve the right penetration and just try and make sure that you've got all those things we mentioned: good soil cover, good depth, good even depth. And the disc systems are going to follow the land contours from row to row a little bit more evenly, so you'll get your row to row establishment more uniform. Our guys will find with the disc systems they'll generally get a little bit lower plant vigour because the crop's growing in undisturbed soil. That slows it down a little, and they'll tend to sow a little earlier to compensate for that. So sow a little early when it's still warmer, and that'll overcome that slight difference in early vigour that they've seen. The other thing people are fitting is some kind of row cleaning setup. In this case, this is one brand called an Arix wheel. So it's a little wheel. There's another one called a Stubble star. It just spins. It's just spinning ahead of the disc and just flicking the stubble out of the way. So the disc's operating into soil, but it's just moving it away from that seeding row. This is, I guess this is just to make the point again that it's really a whole system that you're dealing with. So it isn't that a tine system or a disc system's better. And we tend now to do our research, we look at the whole system. So this project's called Sequences for Seeders. And it was essentially to say, well, if you've got a certain seeder and you really want to make that system work, think about how you're setting up your whole system. And so we've got different farming systems there. We've got an aggressive farming system that's like high cost, high input, high yield, high risk, where people are using Roundup Ready hybrids, expensive pre-emergent herbicides. They're just going out and really wanting to set things up. Conservative systems using a cheaper TT, OP, canola. And the sustainable one has a legume in the system as well. And so you can sort of see there, there's that you can have success with any of these systems, but it's about knowing your costs. It's about knowing what impact there might be. The one I've marked in red was I guess you'd say the one that didn't do so well was the disc seeder in that conservative system, and that was related to the fact that the treflan didn't work. And this had a lot of herbicide-resistant ryegrass, and so it was really about not controlling the weed well enough in that system. That's why that disc system sort of didn't succeed there. And you can see even with differences in plant establishment at the yield levels we were achieving, it wasn't so much that, it was other things to do with costs and other issues. So it's just important to put things into context. So in summary, as I said, you can have success with any system. Remember those basics about what you need to get plants established, whether you're in stubble or not, and it's really trying to achieve that even and suitable seeding depth for your system. Avoid hair pinning. Also avoid a situation where the residues and the soil fall back into the row. And another thing people have probably been doing in Australia at least is over-consolidating with the press wheel. So canola is a small seed. If you really compact above it too hard, it's going to struggle. It's going to have to struggle out of that. So be careful not to over-consolidate. And if you're in doubt, as I said before, if you can't control some of these factors, it's better to increase your seeding rate, go for larger seed and hybrid seed and sow early. Those are all things that are going to help you deal with situations where you really can't, where you know you've got a bit of a rough seed bed and you can't do much about it. And yeah, with that I'll finish and take any questions if there's time.
I want to know, if you harvest with a cell-borne stripper head like they do there, do you get the same moist holding capability of the soil? Because it is when you cut high, the sun burns into the stubble, and it can dry out the interrows between the two rows of stubble. But when you cut short and you use a straw chopper and you spread the whole stubble over the entire width, you get more of a matte type of coverage.
Yeah.
And I'm from the opinion that the more stubble flat on the ground will keep more moisture than tall stubble, where the sun can shine right through onto the deck.
Yeah.
Is it true or not?
So we did a lot of work on stubble retention. So the stubble on the soil surface won't stop evaporation, it only slows it down. So over our dry summer, we can have 3-4 months of very dry summer. What happens is the evaporation under thick stubble continues, but it just continues slower. Under bare soil, it evaporates very quickly. Once the water's gone, the evaporation slows to very low. So they kind of both reach the same, over a very long dry period, they both get to the same point of dryness. And often that means we don't see a difference at the end of summer in how much water's in that topsoil, whether it's under stubble or not. But if it rained yesterday, if it rained yesterday and you follow that dry down, for a period of time, it will be wetter under the stubble, and it'll be wetter under more stubble. So there's only a window of time in which it will be moister under the stubble. So the value of the stubble in our system wasn't so much that it's a blanket stopping evaporation, it's that it's a soil cover increasing infiltration. So it stops the rainfall from crusting the soil and the water from running off. So we only really need, we get our growers to manage down to a threshold of stubble where there's at least 70%, 100% soil cover, and most of the advantage for us from the stubble is about infiltration, not about evaporation. And it's just because of that long, dry summer where we just tend to lose it anyway. But if you get a rain, if you're looking for rainfall events in March, and you want to sow into that and have enough moisture there to sow into that, then yes, thicker stubble will be of some advantage.
During the growing season as well?
Yeah, during the growing season up until the canopy closes. Yeah, once the crop canopy is closed, the stubble's really not doing much because it's all.
If you get a dry period in the growing season, where the stubble is flat on the deck, you will keep more moisture, for instance, for that 2 to 3 weeks when another rain comes.
Yeah, until the canopy closes. Once the crop canopy's closed, it's doing most of the. So yeah, it's pretty subtle, but. What was I going to say? The other thing in the summer is the taller straw, like wind is another issue that's affecting evaporative loss. And so anything that's going to slow the wind down, as well as the sun reaching the soil, the wind blowing across the soil, and in that circumstance, the high stubble's possibly doing more. But yeah, for us, it really, and you may be different, I'm not sure how your rain falls, but for us, we did lots of experiments over 5 years where we added stubble, we took stubble away, we had it standing and lying, and in the end it wasn't making a lot of difference to the moisture content we could measure on different dates when we came around to the sowing window. In fact, the main thing we had to do, and you're probably doing it anyway, the main factor in summer that steals water is weeds. So very strict summer weed control was the thing that gave us 40 millimetres more water and 40 kilos more nitrogen. And as long as we kept a minimum amount of stubble, at least about 2.5 tonnes per hectare to cover the soil surface, that was giving us most of the benefit. And the rest became very subtle. Yeah, if you can manage, if you've got equipment that can sow through stubble that thick, then and you can have successful establishment, then there's no reason to remove it. But our guys had a lot of trouble getting through, very high levels of stubble. So economically, it was far better for them to ensure they got a good early successful establishment of the canola than it was to sort of have 6 tonnes of stubble instead of 2 tonnes of stubble.
Rob Wilson from Australia. That's a very good point, and I guess that one of the things with research and what John's doing is really fantastic. But where I am around southern New South Wales, Wagga Wagga, there's a lot of growers doing exactly what you're doing, and because what John is able to show on a short term, growers generally, if they've got stubble on the ground, they tend to sow a little bit earlier, they get the crop up, so then it comes back to what John's saying. Once you've got the crop up and got coverage, the moisture that's already there is going to stay there. So you're on the right track, and I think that what John's saying is when you have a total dry down period, there's not a lot of difference. But certainly when we get early rains, if you've got flat stubble on the ground, under our research trials, if we can get them in early, it's usually where we've had stubble lying on the ground, keeping that moisture. How much moisture it keeps there, we're not sure, but it certainly does have an advantage.